Can you imagine what it would feel like to lose everything in the blink of an eye? One moment, you're riding high, with years of success behind you, and the next, everything you've worked for slips through your fingers. This isn't just any story. This is a tale of judgment, pride, and the kind of mistake that can change your life forever. What would you do if the very people you underestimated turned out to be the ones who held your future in their hands? It's hard to believe, right? But that's exactly what happened to Ella Lawson, a flight attendant who thought she had it all under control. Little did she know, one small decision would send everything crashing down around her. Buckle up, because this story isn't just about a flight. It's about power, respect, and the moment that will haunt Ella forever. Hold tight, because by the end of this, you'll be questioning everything. Can you guess what happens next? Let's find out. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're tuning in from. Is it sunny or snowing where you are? If it's cold, make sure to bundle up, grab a cup of hot tea, and enjoy today's story with your loved ones. Stay healthy in the winter. And don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories to come. Ella Lawson had been a flight attendant for Elite Wings Airlines for over a decade, a company renowned for its impeccable first-class service and clientele from the world's wealthiest circles. To Ella, the airline wasn't just a job. It was an exclusive world where she wielded her authority with grace and precision. Elite Wings had earned its reputation by offering a flying experience that made passengers feel like royalty, and Ella played a pivotal role in ensuring that this image was upheld. Over the years, Ella had encountered every kind of passenger, demanding, impatient, and occasionally rude. But no matter how turbulent the day, she maintained her composure. Her role wasn't just to serve drinks or snacks. It was to provide an unforgettable experience, to make the passengers feel special from the moment they stepped onto the plane. And for Ella, this was second nature. The polished smile, the attentive demeanor, and the quiet confidence. Everything about her radiated professionalism. Tonight, Elite Wings Flight 4209 to New York was about to depart. As the first-class passengers began boarding, Ella took her place by the aircraft door. She scanned the incoming crowd with her usual watchful eyes, already making mental notes of who would need extra attention, who might cause a fuss, and who would be the easygoing ones. After all, her job wasn't just about providing service. It was about managing expectations, sometimes even before the passengers themselves knew what they wanted. As the crowd filed in, Ella's eyes landed on a family in the line, David and Sophia Carter, accompanied by their two young children. At first glance, they didn't seem to be the type of passengers who would normally attract her attention. David wore a simple black suit, and Sophia was dressed in an elegant but understated floral dress. Their children, quiet and well-behaved, followed their parents closely, their small hands clutching their carry-ons. They didn't stand out in the way that some of the other first-class passengers did. No flashy jewelry or designer bags, but something about them piqued Ella's curiosity. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but as she observed them from her position, Ella felt an odd sense of unease. There was something different about them, something that she couldn't quite explain. Perhaps it was the quiet confidence in David's posture, or the calm yet dignified way Sophia interacted with their children. Maybe it was the way they seemed to belong, but without drawing attention to themselves. They were the type of people who moved with quiet purpose, and that alone made them stand out in Ella's eyes. Still, she couldn't quite place the feeling. It wasn't hostility or rudeness, far from it. There was an air of gentleness about the family, but it was an unusual kind of presence, one that made Ella feel off balance. As the Carter family approached her, Ella's professional smile slid into place, but she couldn't help but keep a closer eye on them than she would have on other passengers. David nodded politely as he and his family settled into their seats, and Ella offered her standard greeting. "Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. Carter," she said smoothly, her voice a blend of warmth and efficiency. "I hope you have a pleasant flight." David's smile was subtle, but his eyes held a glimmer of something that made Ella pause. He simply nodded, acknowledging her greeting without the usual pleasantries or small talk. Sophia, too, gave her a gentle but reserved smile before turning her attention to her children, who were already quietly buckling their seatbelts. Ella, though usually unfazed, found herself watching them closely as they got settled. There was something in the way David moved, confident but not arrogant. Sophia, though soft-spoken, carried herself with a quiet authority. It wasn't until they were fully settled in their seats that Ella realized how much her mind had been focused on them. But what was it about this family that made her feel so uneasy? It wasn't just their calmness. It was the sense that they were quietly observing everything around them, too. And for some reason, Ella felt as if she were being watched, scrutinized, even though their eyes never lingered on her for more than a second. It was a strange sensation, one she wasn't used to, especially with first-class passengers who often enjoyed making their presence known. But not the Carters. They were different. As the last passengers boarded, Ella quickly refocused. She couldn't afford to be distracted, not with a flight to oversee. Still, as she moved down the aisle to attend to the other passengers, the image of the Carter family lingered in the back of her mind. She told herself it was nothing, just a momentary feeling. After all, they were just like any other first-class family, weren't they? But deep down, Ella knew she was wrong. Something about them was far from ordinary, and she couldn't shake the feeling that this flight, for her, was going to be anything but routine. She tried to dismiss the feeling. After all, she was a seasoned professional. She had dealt with plenty of passengers who acted reserved and modest, and often those were the ones who could be the most difficult. Maybe that was all it was, this subtle, silent defiance that made her feel unsettled. She had always prided herself on maintaining a level of control over every situation, and perhaps it was this family's composed manner that made her feel like they were subtly questioning her authority. Ella adjusted her uniform, willing herself to shake off the feeling. She walked toward the galley, telling herself that there was no need to overthink it. Her job was to ensure the comfort and safety of every passenger, regardless of who they were or how they behaved. Still, as she walked down the aisle to make sure everyone was properly seated, her gaze flicked back toward the Carters. They were in the middle of the cabin now, the children tucked in beside their parents, speaking in soft tones. The family was smiling, whispering, but there was an air about them that seemed out of place in a cabin full of wealthy passengers. It was almost as if they didn't belong. Ella tried to busy herself with the pre-flight checks, but her mind kept returning to the Carters. She kept telling herself that she was being irrational. What made them any different from the other first-class passengers? Why did she feel this strange unease, like she was on the verge of discovering something she wasn't supposed to? She knew it wasn't their appearance. There were other first-class passengers who didn't dress in designer clothes or make a show of wealth. No, it wasn't about what they were wearing or how they acted. It was something more subtle, something in their quiet presence, in the way they carried themselves. As the last few passengers settled in, Ella stood by the galley, still trying to dismiss her thoughts. Her duties called her to ensure that every first-class passenger was comfortable, so she made her rounds. She offered drinks, checked on the passengers, smiled politely, but her gaze kept flicking back to the Carters. They hadn't asked for anything, hadn't even made a peep since sitting down. They were the perfect passengers, which should have been reassuring, but it only added to her growing sense of unease. It wasn't that they were misbehaving. Quite the opposite. They were impeccably well-behaved, which made Ella feel even more uncomfortable. In the world of luxury flying, the elite passengers often had a way of asserting their dominance, their entitlement visible in every word and glance. The Carters, however, had none of that. They seemed almost out of place in first class, yet they carried themselves with a quiet dignity that seemed to be a direct contrast to the usual brashness Ella was accustomed to. Ella found herself walking past their row again, more out of habit than necessity. David was looking out of the window, his expression calm and distant. Sophia was reading a book, her focus completely absorbed in the pages. The children had fallen asleep, resting their heads against the plush headrests. Still, there was something about them, something about the way they carried themselves, that tugged at her thoughts. She was disturbed, though she couldn't understand why. Was it their utter lack of arrogance? Or was it their self-assurance, a quiet confidence that didn't demand attention but somehow seemed to draw it? Ella had seen countless wealthy passengers, each with their own sense of entitlement or over-the-top displays of wealth. But the Carters were different. They didn't seem to fit the mold. Perhaps she was overthinking it. It wasn't unusual for Ella to feel a bit of discomfort around passengers who didn't fit the expected pattern, but this felt different. Something about the way David and Sophia looked at her, almost as if they saw right through her, to the heart of who she was and what she stood for, made her feel exposed. They weren't rude or challenging her. They were simply there, observing, and it unsettled her in a way she couldn't explain. As she made her way back to the galley, Ella tried to calm her thoughts. There was no reason to feel this way. The Carters were passengers like any other, and it was her job to serve them with professionalism and grace. But even as she focused on her tasks, her mind kept returning to them, wondering why she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Ella Lawson was making her usual rounds through the cabin when she felt a presence approach from behind. The faint sound of polished shoes clicking against the floor made her turn just in time to see a man in a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit standing in front of her. He was tall, with sharp features, and exuded an air of quiet authority. Ella instantly recognized him as one of the passengers in first class, though she hadn't yet interacted with him directly. "Excuse me, Miss Lawson?" His voice was calm, but there was a certain firmness to it that immediately grabbed her attention. "Yes, sir. How may I assist you?" Ella responded with her practiced smile, already preparing herself for whatever minor complaint this passenger might have. It was routine for her to handle everything from complaints about the food to requests for more legroom, but this man had a different air about him. "Do you have a moment?" he asked, his eyes narrowing slightly, studying her with a gaze that was more focused than she was accustomed to. There was something about his demeanor that made her feel uneasy. Ella hesitated for a moment, but then nodded, giving him her full attention. "Of course. What can I help you with, sir?" He glanced briefly at the back of the cabin where the Carter family was seated, quietly chatting with their children. Then he turned back to her, his voice low enough not to disturb the other passengers. "It seems that you've been giving some undue attention to the Carter family, haven't you?" Ella blinked, a little taken aback by his directness. "I'm sorry, I don't understand what you mean," she replied, maintaining her professional tone but feeling the unease creep up again. The man's expression didn't change, though his voice grew a little more insistent. "I've been watching you for the past few minutes, and I couldn't help but notice how you've been treating them differently. Is there a particular reason?" Ella's stomach tightened. She felt the familiar rush of defensiveness rise in her chest. "I'm not sure what you mean, sir. I'm simply doing my job, providing the best service for all of our passengers," she said, forcing the words out with a professionalism that masked the discomfort she was feeling. The man didn't seem convinced. "I understand that you're trying to maintain a certain level of exclusivity for first class, but the Carter family paid for their tickets just like everyone else here. They're entitled to the same level of service, wouldn't you agree?" His voice was still calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it now, as if challenging her directly. Ella felt a knot form in her throat. Her eyes briefly flicked toward the Carter family. David and Sophia were sitting quietly, their children absorbed in their tablets. They hadn't caused any trouble, hadn't asked for special treatment. So why did she feel like something was wrong? Why did she feel irritated every time she looked at them? The man's eyes followed hers and then returned to her face. "You're not treating them as if they belong here." "Why?" he asked, his tone now sharper. Ella swallowed hard. "I don't know what you mean. I've been doing my job, nothing more." Her voice was tight now, her words slightly clipped. She felt an overwhelming urge to explain herself, but no words came. Why couldn't she shake the unease she felt whenever she looked at the Carters? The man studied her for a long moment, his eyes calculating, before he sighed. "I think you do know what I mean, Miss Lawson," he said quietly. "It's not just about professionalism, is it? There's something else going on here. Maybe you're letting something cloud your judgment, something you don't want to admit." Ella's heart began to race. Was he implying something about her? She felt the walls she had carefully built over the years start to crack. For a moment, she was speechless. The realization that this stranger had seen through her in such a short amount of time rattled her. I don't know what you're talking about," Ella managed, though she wasn't sure she believed her own words. She forced herself to smile, but it felt thin and hollow, a facade she was desperately trying to hold up. The man didn't look convinced. He seemed to be assessing her, studying her reaction. "I think you do," he said, "and I think it's time you address it." Ella could feel her pulse quicken, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Her mind raced, trying to find a way to justify her actions. She was a professional. She prided herself on her ability to manage any situation, to stay calm under pressure. But this was different. There was a growing feeling, a discomfort she couldn't explain, that had been building ever since the Carters had boarded. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't in control. The man smiled faintly, as if sensing her internal struggle. "I don't want to cause trouble, Miss Lawson," he said, "but I do want to make sure the right thing is done. I'll be speaking with the captain, and if necessary, with corporate. Everyone deserves the same service. No one is above that." With that, he turned and walked back down the aisle, leaving Ella standing in the narrow space between the seats. Her heart was pounding now. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had just shifted, that she had been seen for the first time in a way she hadn't expected. And in that moment, Ella didn't know what was worse, the fact that this passenger had noticed her discomfort, or the fact that she had no idea how to address it. The hum of the plane's engines was a steady background to the silence in the galley. Ella Lawson leaned against the counter, her hands resting on the smooth surface as she tried to collect her thoughts. She had seen hundreds of families like the Carters over the years, families who flew first class as a matter of routine, who were used to the luxuries that came with the privilege of an exclusive airline like Elite Wings. But this family, something about them was different. Her mind kept returning to the interaction with the man in the suit, the one who had confronted her about the way she treated the Carters. His words kept echoing in her head. They deserve the same level of service, don't they? She had tried to dismiss him, tried to convince herself that it was just another complaint, just another passenger who didn't understand the pressures of her job. But now, as she stood in the quiet galley, away from the eyes of the passengers, the weight of it all settled on her. Ella couldn't help but wonder, had she misjudged the Carters? She had no solid reason to feel the way she did about them, but there was an undeniable discomfort that had been building all throughout the flight. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how irrational it seemed. The family had done nothing to warrant her suspicion or unease. They had been nothing but polite, composed, and respectful. So why had she allowed herself to treat them differently? She closed her eyes, trying to clear her mind. But her thoughts were clouded by a growing sense of self-doubt. Was this the same Ella who had prided herself on being able to read people like an open book? Was she now allowing her own subconscious biases to cloud her judgment? She had worked with some of the most demanding passengers over the years, but none of them had made her feel this way, uneasy, defensive, like something was just off. Ella had spent over 10 years working for Elite Wings, a company known for its commitment to excellence. She had always prided herself on her ability to manage high-profile customers, to provide a seamless experience that made them feel special and valued. But now, as she stood there in the galley, she couldn't escape the feeling that she had failed. Failed the Carters, and worse, failed herself. What had caused her to act the way she did? Was it their calm, almost too composed demeanor? Their quiet confidence that seemed to challenge her authority, even without them saying a word? Maybe it was the way they had so effortlessly blended in with the other first-class passengers, neither seeking attention nor blending into the background. They didn't flaunt their wealth. They didn't boast or demand special treatment. Yet there was an undeniable presence about them, a quiet strength that Ella couldn't quite place. She was used to being in control. She prided herself on that, but tonight, for the first time in years, she felt vulnerable. And what bothered her most was that she couldn't figure out why. As the flight continued, Ella found herself drifting in and out of her thoughts. She tried to focus on the duties at hand, serving drinks, checking in with passengers, making sure everything was running smoothly, but her mind kept wandering back to the Carters, to David, with his calm, yet intense gaze, to Sophia, who had a serene elegance about her that Ella had found almost disarming. It wasn't that they had done anything wrong. It was what they hadn't done, anything to fit the mold of the typical first-class passenger. That was what bothered her. She had worked with countless wealthy individuals, many of whom were demanding, some of whom could be downright rude. They expected the best and didn't hesitate to make their desires known. But the Carters hadn't been like that. They hadn't raised their voices. They hadn't made any grand requests or complaints. They were simply present, quiet, composed, unassuming. And that was what unsettled Ella. She grabbed a small notebook from her pocket and began writing down her thoughts, trying to process everything she had been feeling. The familiar motion of writing helped ground her, but the more she wrote, the more she began to realize something she hadn't wanted to admit. She had allowed her own biases to affect her behavior. Her mind wandered back to her training days, the lessons on customer service, the reminders about treating every passenger equally, regardless of their background or status. Ella had always believed in those principles, always prided herself on being the consummate professional. Yet, here she was, treating a family who had paid the same premium price as everyone else with a certain distance. Was it their lack of ostentation? Was it their subtle challenge to the unspoken hierarchy that existed between first-class passengers and the staff? Ella wasn't sure, but the discomfort she felt wasn't going away. As the flight continued and the cabin lights dimmed for the night, Ella found herself walking past the Carters' seats once more. She couldn't help but glance down at them as she did. David and Sophia were quietly speaking in low tones, their children asleep against the windows, their faces peaceful. It hit Ella then. Her discomfort wasn't about the Carters. It was about her own insecurities, her own fear of losing control. Her thoughts were interrupted by a chime, signaling the end of her shift in the galley. With a heavy sigh, Ella stood up and made her way back to the main cabin. As she passed the Carters one last time, she looked at them, this time with a different sense of awareness. They hadn't done anything wrong. She was the one who had been wrong. For the first time that evening, Ella felt a small wave of humility. She wasn't the perfect professional she had always prided herself on being, and that realization, though painful, would shape the rest of her actions on this flight. The truth was undeniable now. She had misjudged them. And no matter how much she tried to dismiss it, that nagging feeling wouldn't go away. The only way to undo the damage was to face it head-on. And Ella knew, deep down, that it was going to be much harder than she had ever imagined. As the hours of the flight passed, Ella Lawson couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She moved up and down the aisles, making sure to keep up the appearance of professionalism, but her mind constantly drifted back to the Carter family. Despite her attempts to focus on the job at hand, she couldn't help but notice the way Sophia and David Carter quietly observed her from their seats. Sophia, the mother, was the most composed of the two. She had maintained a serene and calm demeanor throughout the flight, her eyes never betraying any sign of discomfort or annoyance. She spoke quietly with her children, who were sitting next to her, their soft laughter filling the air occasionally. The family appeared peaceful, almost too peaceful, as though they were in perfect control of the situation. But there was something else Ella noticed about Sophia, something subtle. Sophia's gaze occasionally flicked towards Ella, never in an overtly confrontational way, but always with an undercurrent of scrutiny. The woman didn't seem angry or even upset, but there was a sharpness in her gaze that Ella couldn't fully interpret. It was the kind of look that left her feeling exposed, as if Sophia could see through the thin veneer of professionalism that Ella had so carefully cultivated. Ella tried to convince herself that it was just her nerves getting the better of her. Maybe she was overthinking it. But as she passed by Sophia's seat once again, she couldn't shake the feeling that the woman was silently resisting her in some way. Not overtly, not loudly, but with a quiet strength that was impossible to ignore. David, the father, seemed no different. He sat with the same air of composed calm, his eyes occasionally lifting from his book to survey the cabin. He spoke in soft tones to Sophia, his words always measured and purposeful. His demeanor was almost disarming in its serenity, and yet it was clear that David wasn't intimidated by Ella in the slightest. He didn't demand attention, nor did he try to engage with her in any way, but there was a subtle message in his calm that Ella was beginning to recognize. They weren't afraid of her. They weren't bothered by the unease she had projected. In fact, it seemed as though their silence spoke louder than any confrontation could. Ella passed by the Carters' seats again, this time deliberately avoiding eye contact with them. Her pulse quickened. There was something about their calm that unsettled her. She had expected a family like theirs, polite, composed, but perhaps also a little deferential to her authority. After all, she was a flight attendant on an exclusive airline, and she had worked hard to maintain her position. She had encountered many high-profile passengers over the years, but the Carters were different. There was no sense of intimidation or submission in their presence. They weren't here to challenge her, but neither were they willing to bend to her power. As she continued with her duties, Ella found herself struggling to focus on the flight. She couldn't understand why this family, who had done nothing wrong, seemed to have a magnetic pull on her thoughts. Every glance, every exchange between David and Sophia was amplified in her mind. She kept coming back to the quiet resistance that was emerging, and it frustrated her. It was as though the Carters had quietly decided that they wouldn't play by her rules, but they weren't making a scene about it either. The more she observed them, the more she realized that they were not just silently resisting her. They were resisting the entire system of unspoken hierarchies that she represented. Ella had spent years cultivating her role, learning to anticipate the needs of first-class passengers, treating them with the utmost care and attention, as though they were the elite. But now, she wondered if the Carters were quietly questioning the very foundation of that power. They weren't loud about it. They didn't need to be. They simply existed outside the bounds of her influence, and that was enough to make Ella uneasy. It was a strange sensation, this growing recognition that the Carters weren't playing the game, yet didn't seem to want to upset it either. As the flight progressed, Ella noticed how they interacted with the other passengers and crew. They were polite, but never overly solicitous. Their children, well-behaved and quiet, rarely needed assistance, and when they did, Sophia was always calm but firm with the attendants. There was a sense of quiet control in their every action. Even when the crew made their rounds with drinks and snacks, the Carters' requests were always measured, never demanding. Ella continued to wrestle with her thoughts, but every time she glanced at the family, it became clearer that she wasn't dealing with any ordinary passengers. There was no drama with the Carters. There were no complaints, no outbursts. Yet in their silence, in their calm, they made Ella question herself in ways she hadn't before. The tension was subtle, but it was real, and it was beginning to weigh heavily on her. The cabin was quiet as the soft hum of the engines filled the space, a stark contrast to the storm of thoughts swirling in Ella Lawson's mind. It was nearing the halfway point of the flight, and the usual hustle of in-flight service had slowed. Most passengers were either dozing or quietly reading, creating a peaceful, almost surreal atmosphere. It was in this stillness that Ella found herself passing by the Carters' seats once again. She had been avoiding them, her own unease growing with every glance she stole in their direction. It wasn't long before Ella's professional mask began to slip. The weight of her behavior was starting to weigh heavily on her. She had acted out of instinct, guided by an unshakable belief that she was in control, that she was right. Yet the nagging feeling that she was wrong, terribly wrong, refused to leave her alone. She had been the one to judge them, to single them out without any clear reason. But the quiet strength of Sophia's gaze and David's measured calmness haunted her, refusing to let her rest. As Ella passed by their row for the third time, she noticed Sophia's eyes tracking her movements. This time, however, there was no subtlety in her gaze. It was direct, unwavering, like a silent challenge. Before Ella could walk past, David's calm voice stopped her in her tracks. "Miss Lawson," he said, his tone polite but firm. "Can we have a word?" Ella turned toward him, her stomach tightening. She had known this moment would come. Something about the family, something about the way they carried themselves, had been too much for her to ignore for long. She had hoped that her growing discomfort would dissipate, but now it was clear that she could not escape the reckoning that was coming. "Of course," Ella said, trying to steady her voice. "Is there something I can assist you with?" David and Sophia exchanged a look, one that spoke volumes. Then Sophia leaned slightly forward in her seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap. There was no anger in her demeanor, but there was an unmistakable sense of resolve in her eyes. "We'd like to understand why you've been treating us differently," Sophia said, her voice calm but unmistakably sharp. "You've been giving us strange looks, and we can't help but feel like we're being singled out." Ella blinked, caught off guard. She had anticipated a confrontation, but not one that was so straightforward. She opened her mouth to respond but faltered, her professional instincts momentarily abandoning her. How could she explain this? How could she justify the actions she had taken? David, noticing her hesitation, continued in the same calm tone that had unnerved Ella throughout the flight. "We've flown first class before, Miss Lawson," he said, "and we understand how things work. We've always been treated with the utmost respect, regardless of where we're from or how we look. But today has been different, and we're asking you why." Ella's throat felt tight, and her words seemed to stick to the roof of her mouth. How could she respond to that? She had no answer that made sense. In her mind, she had justified her actions. She had told herself that their calmness, their quiet composure, had bothered her in ways she couldn't quite explain. But now, standing in front of them, she realized that there was no excuse for what she had done. "You've paid the same premium price for your tickets as everyone else here," David continued, his eyes unwavering. "You deserve the same service, the same respect. And yet, I can't help but feel like you're treating us differently for reasons we don't understand." Ella's gaze dropped to the floor for a moment, and for the first time, she felt truly vulnerable. She had always prided herself on maintaining control, on being able to manage every situation that came her way. But now, facing the Carters, she couldn't escape the reality that her biases had crept into her behavior. They had somehow triggered a reaction in her that she couldn't explain, but now it was out in the open, and there was no hiding from it. Sophia leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but insistent. "We don't want to make a scene, Miss Lawson. We just want to understand why this is happening. Why we're being treated this way when we've done nothing to deserve it." Ella felt the weight of their words. The silence between them stretched out, thick with tension. She could feel the heat rising to her cheeks, her professional facade cracking. There was no defense she could offer, no explanation that would make what she had done right. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Ella spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know," she admitted. "I've been working in this industry for years, and I've never let anything like this happen. But today, for some reason, I've treated you differently, and I don't know why." David's expression softened slightly, but his eyes remained serious. "Miss Lawson, it's not just about what's happened today. It's about the larger picture. You're not the first to act this way, and unfortunately, you probably won't be the last. But you have an opportunity to do better, to reflect on your actions and learn from this." Ella swallowed hard. She could feel the sting of guilt settling in her chest. For the first time in her career, she was confronted not by a complaint or a request, but by the stark reality of her own actions. "I'm sorry," she finally said, her voice breaking slightly. "I truly am." David nodded, accepting her apology, though there was no sense of triumph in his expression. "We all make mistakes, Miss Lawson. It's how we handle them that defines us." Ella nodded, feeling the weight of their words. As she turned to walk away, her thoughts were heavy with self-reflection. She knew this wasn't just about one family or one flight. It was about something much larger, and for the first time in years, she felt the need to look inward, to examine the biases she had carried with her without realizing it. She had no idea what the future would hold, but one thing was clear. She couldn't go back to being the person she was before. Ella Lawson stood frozen in the aisle, her heart pounding as David and Sophia Carter's words settled into her mind. The quiet moment in which they had asked to speak with her had quickly turned into an uncomfortable confrontation. Her attempts at remaining calm, to hide the shame she was beginning to feel, were futile. David's steady gaze, the calm yet unwavering tone in his voice, made it clear that this was not a conversation she could escape from. "We will be reporting this to corporate," David said again, his words measured but carrying the weight of an undeniable certainty. "This is not just about us, Miss Lawson. This is about the kind of service that Elite Wings Airlines prides itself on, the kind of values it claims to uphold." Ella felt as though the air around her had grown thick. She had been expecting some kind of reprimand, of course, but hearing it come from this family, this quiet, composed family, was more painful than she had anticipated. They weren't yelling. They weren't demanding anything outrageous. They were simply speaking the truth, and that truth cut deeper than any angry outburst could. Sophia, her voice soft but firm, added, "We understand how important customer service is to this company. We also understand that we were treated differently, and that's not just unacceptable, it's hurtful." Ella's mouth went dry. Her mind raced, but there was no excuse she could offer, no justification that would make her actions seem reasonable. She had been caught. The biases she had tried to push aside, the subtle judgments she had made about the Carters, about their presence in first class, about their demeanor, were laid bare for everyone to see. "It reflects poorly on you," David continued, his gaze unwavering, "but it reflects even worse on elite wings. If you treat customers like us this way, what does that say about the company? What does that say about the culture here?" Ella could feel her cheeks flush. She tried to speak, but the words didn't come. All her years of experience, all the time she had prided herself on being able to manage any situation, seemed irrelevant now. She had crossed a line, and she couldn't take back the damage she had caused. David looked over at Sophia, who nodded, her expression as calm as ever. Then, turning back to Ella, David's tone softened, though it still held a firmness that made Ella's stomach twist. "We're not asking for any kind of public apology, but this needs to be addressed. It's not just about this flight. It's about the culture you're contributing to, whether you realize it or not." Ella opened her mouth again, but still, the words failed her. What could she say? How could she explain that her discomfort was based on something she could barely put into words, let alone justify? She had acted on instinct, a feeling that told her something about the Carters wasn't right. But now, as she stood before them, she realized that it wasn't them, it was her. She had let her own biases cloud her judgment, and now she would face the consequences. David's voice softened further. "Miss Lawson, you've been in this industry for a long time, right? You know how important it is to treat people with respect, no matter who they are or where they come from. And you know that when you're in a position like yours, your actions affect not just the individual passengers, but the whole company." Ella nodded, her eyes dropping to the floor, unable to meet his gaze. She knew he was right. She knew that her behavior had undermined everything she had worked for, everything Elite Wings Airlines stood for. Her actions, in that moment, had not only reflected poorly on her, but also on the company she had been so proud to serve for over a decade. The shame was overwhelming, and for the first time in her career, she felt truly small. Sophia spoke again, her voice gentle but firm. "We understand that mistakes happen, but this goes beyond a mistake, Miss Lawson. This was a choice to treat us differently, to make assumptions about us based on how we look or how we carry ourselves." Ella's heart sank further as the words hit her like a wave. It was true. She had made assumptions, and those assumptions had led her to treat the Carters as though they didn't belong in first class, as though their presence there was somehow an affront to the expectations Ella had set in her mind. "We'll be reaching out to corporate," David said, his voice now resolute. "This isn't about revenge or getting you in trouble. This is about making sure that this kind of behavior isn't allowed to continue, that it doesn't go unchecked." Ella opened her mouth, her hands trembling, but once again, no words came. She wanted to plead, to explain that she didn't mean for it to happen, that she had never intended to hurt anyone. But in the silence that followed, she realized that her words wouldn't matter. What mattered now was the reality of her actions. She had crossed a line, and there would be consequences. As she stood there, helpless and ashamed, the weight of her decisions settled over her like a heavy fog. She had worked for this company for years, prided herself on her professionalism, and yet here she was, facing the truth that she had allowed her own prejudices to influence her actions. The Carters didn't need to say anything more. They had made their point. They had given Ella the harshest lesson she could ever learn. That no amount of years in the industry, no amount of polished professionalism, could protect her from the consequences of her own bias. David and Sophia Carter returned to their seats, their quiet resistance leaving Ella standing there, alone, facing the full weight of her actions. And as the plane continued its flight, Ella Lawson realized that her career, her reputation, and her future with Elite Wings Airlines had just been irrevocably altered. The damage had been done. The rest of the flight passed in a haze of silence for Ella Lawson. She moved through the aisles mechanically, her mind too overwhelmed to focus on anything other than the conversation she had just had with the Carters. Their words echoed relentlessly in her mind. The disappointment in their voices, the quiet but firm determination to report her behavior to corporate. By the time the plane touched down at their destination, the reality of what had happened had begun to settle in. Ella knew what was coming, but the anticipation didn't make it any easier. She returned to the galley, her hands trembling as she tried to go through the motions of finalizing paperwork, but nothing felt real anymore. It was as if the weight of the world was pressing down on her shoulders, suffocating her. As she stood by the counter, staring at the untouched paperwork in front of her, her phone buzzed in her pocket. Startled, she reached for it, her heart skipping a beat as she saw the notification on the screen. An email from Elite Wings Airlines. With a deep breath, Ella opened it, her hands unsteady as she read the subject line, "Decision regarding employment." She knew what it meant before she even opened the email, but the words still hit her like a punch to the stomach. She skimmed through the introduction, the corporate jargon that sounded so cold, so impersonal. But then her eyes locked on the key part of the message. After a thorough review of the incident on Flight 512 and consultations with our leadership team, Elite Wings Airlines has made the decision to terminate your employment effective immediately. This decision comes as a result of serious violations of company policies, particularly those relating to the treatment of passengers and the company's commitment to inclusivity and respect for all customers. Ella felt the blood drain from her face as she read those words over and over. Her hands went clammy as the weight of what she had done settled on her like a cold, unrelenting fog. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat a painful reminder of the mistake she had made. The email continued with a detailed explanation of her violations, how her actions had not only breached Elite Wings' standards but also reflected poorly on the company's reputation. The final blow came at the end, where the email concluded with an impersonal note about her severance package and the instructions for returning her uniform and access credentials. Please arrange to return all company property, including your uniform and ID badge, to the HR department. Your final paycheck will be issued in the coming days, and we wish you the best in your future endeavors. Ella reread the email multiple times, as though she could will the words to change, as if the reality of what she was reading might somehow reverse itself. But no matter how many times she scanned the email, it didn't change. Her heart felt heavy in her chest, the cold reality of her termination sinking in with each passing second. Her career, 15 years with Elite Wings Airlines, was over. She dropped her phone onto the counter, her hands shaking. The email had felt like an out-of-body experience. She had worked so hard, built her reputation, earned her position. She had prided herself on her professionalism, on being the perfect flight attendant, the one who could handle any situation with grace and poise. But now, everything she had worked for had crumbled in an instant. Her thoughts spiraled as the implications of the situation became clear. She had been fired, not for a momentary lapse in judgment, but for something far deeper. The words discriminatory treatment haunted her, and she knew in her heart that they weren't just corporate buzzwords. They were the truth. Ella felt a knot form in her stomach. She thought back to the Carters, the way they had spoken to her, the disappointment in their voices. She had been so sure of herself, so certain that she was in the right. But now it was clear that she had allowed her own biases to cloud her judgment. She had misread the situation, and her actions had consequences. The Carters had been right all along. She had treated them differently based on her assumptions, based on an unspoken prejudice that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. For the first time in years, Ella felt completely exposed. She had prided herself on being the model employee, the one who never let anything get under her skin, the one who could handle even the most difficult passengers with a smile. But now, she was nothing more than a cautionary tale, a reminder of what could happen when someone let their biases slip through the cracks. She slumped down against the counter, her thoughts racing. What was she supposed to do now? How could she rebuild everything that had been taken away from her in an instant? Her career at Elite Wings Airlines was over, but her life, her future, felt uncertain. In that moment, Ella realized that this wasn't just about losing her job. It was about something much deeper, something that went beyond the confines of her professional identity. She had failed herself, and in doing so, she had failed others. The weight of that realization was more than she could bear. For the rest of the flight, Ella remained in a daze, mechanically finishing her duties but unable to focus on anything other than the finality of the email and the consequences of her actions. As the plane landed and the passengers began to disembark, she gathered her things with a sense of numbness. The Carters had already left, their quiet departure almost an afterthought. Ella knew that their lives would go on, that they would continue to fly with Elite Wings or another airline, and that the moment she had experienced on this flight would fade into their memories, replaced by other encounters, other stories. But for Ella, it was different. She stood in the galley, staring out the window, and realized that the journey she had been on, the one that had seemed so certain, had come to an abrupt end, and she had no idea where to go from here. As she made her way off the plane, her thoughts were consumed by the fallout. How would her colleagues react? Would they pity her, or would they see her as a failure? And what about her family? Would they understand what had happened, or would they be disappointed in her, too? Ella didn't know the answers. All she knew was that her world had changed forever. The career she had worked so hard to build was now a distant memory, replaced by the harsh reality of her actions. She was left to grapple with the fallout, to live with the consequences of her own decisions, and to try and make sense of how she had gotten here. The hours following Ella Lawson's termination from Elite Wings Airlines felt like a blur. She had walked off the plane, her head spinning, her stomach churning with each step. It was as though the ground had shifted beneath her, leaving her unsure of her footing, unsure of who she was without the title she had held for so long. Ella found herself at home, sitting in the dim light of her living room, the silence around her only amplifying the weight of the moment. She had been with Elite Wings for over 15 years, a company that had defined much of her adult life. The reputation, the respect, the sense of accomplishment she had cultivated in those years, all of it was gone now, replaced by the stinging truth of her actions. The email from corporate, the harsh words that outlined her failings, still felt like a punch to the gut. But amidst the swirling emotions of anger, disbelief, and shame, something else began to emerge. A quiet recognition of responsibility. She couldn't deny it anymore. What had happened with the Carters was not just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of deeper, more ingrained biases that she had carried with her for far too long. Biases she had never fully acknowledged or confronted. Ella sat back, her mind drifting back to the Carters, the calm, composed family who had, in a sense, been the catalyst for this moment. She replayed the encounters in her mind, the subtle judgments she had made about them based solely on their appearance and demeanor. They had been so polite, so poised, and yet she had felt threatened by their quiet strength. She had interpreted their calmness as an affront to her authority, not understanding that it wasn't a challenge. It was simply who they were. Her discomfort with them had been rooted in something far deeper than their actions. It was her own insecurities, her own assumptions about what it meant to be worthy of first-class service. She had mistaken their humility for something inferior, when in reality, it was her own arrogance that had blinded her. "I was wrong," she whispered aloud to the empty room. "I was so wrong." The realization hit her like a wave. For years, she had prided herself on treating passengers with respect, but in truth, she had never fully examined her own biases. She had allowed her assumptions about wealth, about status, to dictate how she treated others. She had allowed herself to think that her position as a flight attendant, as someone who was responsible for providing service, gave her the right to judge others. Ella thought back to her years at Elite Wings. The company had prided itself on offering luxury and exclusivity, but in doing so, it had created an environment where inequality was normalized. She had been complicit in perpetuating this system, even if she hadn't realized it at the time. She had been trained to serve the elite, to make them feel like royalty, but in doing so, she had forgotten that every passenger deserved to be treated with dignity, regardless of their appearance, their background, or their station in life. Now, as she sat alone in the quiet of her home, Ella could no longer ignore the truth. She had failed to uphold the values that she had once believed in. Her actions had cost her the job she had spent so many years building, and yet, in a strange way, she knew that this was not the end. It was a turning point. For the first time in her life, Ella felt the weight of her responsibility, not just as a flight attendant, but as a human being. She had been given an opportunity to change, to confront the prejudices that had quietly shaped her interactions with others. And though the consequences of her actions had been severe, she knew that she couldn't ignore this moment. It was an opportunity for growth. "I can do better," she said softly, though there was no one to hear her words. The path forward was uncertain, and Ella wasn't sure what the future held. But she knew that she had to learn from this. She had to take responsibility for her actions, face the uncomfortable truths about herself, and begin the process of change. She couldn't erase the past, but she could work to ensure that it didn't define her. The pain of losing her job was still fresh, the shame still lingering in her chest, but there was a glimmer of something else as well: hope. The hope that she could become a better person, someone who would never again let her own biases shape her actions. As the evening wore on, Ella found herself making plans. She would seek out training, perhaps even volunteer to work with organizations that promoted inclusivity and equality in the workplace. She would educate herself, learn to confront her own biases head-on. And, most importantly, she would never forget the lesson she had learned at such a painful cost. True professionalism wasn't just about providing good service. It was about seeing people as they truly were, without judgment, without assumptions. Ella Lawson's journey was far from over. It was only just beginning. Thank you so much for sticking with us until the end of this story. We truly appreciate your time and support. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an inspiring tale. See you in the next one.